Hi everybody and welcome to Social Inequality for week 4. My name's Donna Bridges and this week we're going to be looking at the political sphere, specifically understanding the Australian state and how resources and power are distributed, and understanding the role the state plays in equality and inequality, and that basically means how we distribute those resources through the government. I've got a question for you. How powerful is the state in a modern democracy? Some people are saying that the state is becoming more of a toothless tiger because of globalization. But neoliberalism does seem to be changing the welfare state. So do we remember what neoliberalism was from last week? We'll have a quick revision this week, but mostly we'll focus on the impact of neoliberalism on the welfare state. So do you think that we are facing more inequality because of neoliberalism? And do you think that calling the welfare state the social state is a better term? So politics is more than about Canberra. It's about our attitudes and ideologies, such as neoliberalism. That's an ideology as well as an approach. It's also an ideology that stems from liberalism, which is an approach to government, which democracy comes from, the idea that we are free and that we are equal. And what policies inform the welfare state, and how do we construct welfare, the idea of welfare, the idea of the poor? Which poor do we feel are deserving and why? How do we provide services to the needy? All of these things are done by government. So talking about politics is also about talking about political marginalisation. Are people included or excluded politically? And is this based on where they live, their gender, their ethnicity, indigeneity, and so on? All of these things are political issues. Therefore, politics is also about identity and social marginalisation and social identity. So let's talk about democracy for a while. Australia is a liberal secular democracy. That means that we keep religion and politics separate, and that our democracy is underpinned by liberal values, the values that come with democracy of freedom and equality. Democracy basically means the rule of the people. Democratic principles are combined with our institutions, and these are supposed to embody liberal freedoms. You might ask yourself whether they do, and if they don't, why not? The particular democracy that we live in is a constitutional monarch. It's based on the Westminster system, which comes from Britain, and it's empowered by the separation of powers. And the judicial independence basically means that our court system is independent from our government, our executive and our parliament. All of those arms, which are the people running the country, and the parliament, which is the Senate and includes the opposition, they're all separate, and they all comment on each other's activities, and they all keep each other honest, which is also the role of the fourth estate, the media, is to keep everybody honest, and also to keep the citizenry informed about what's going on. The values and principles that underpin democracy are that we have rights. What do we have the right to do then? Well, importantly, we have the right to free speech, so we can write and say whatever we want. We have the right to be protected by law and by the government. We have the right to vote, to be treated equally, to have our own beliefs and to practice those beliefs. And we're free. So we have free press. We have the right to assemble and to protest, to form and join organisations, to associate with whoever it is that we choose. And with those rights comes obligations. So if you look back through the list and you see something like free speech, what is an obligation that we might connect to free speech? To be protected by the law, that means that we need to allow others as well. We are obliged to allow others to be protected by the law, to allow others to vote, and so on. So we are obliged to be peaceful, to respect the rights of others. Okay, challenges include, so if you look at that list, you can probably come up with some challenges for each of them. But of course, inequality is one of the challenges of democracy, because how do we have a liberal democracy that represents all of the people all of the time? Disenchantment with government is a big problem of democracy, because it is difficult for the democracy to represent everybody. Globalization and these populations that are in flux, and as many people say, that a demise of the state is an issue for democracy. So true political representation is a big issue. The tyranny of the majority, the inability of the state to represent everyone. So let's have a look at some of the problems with democracy. Compromise is a problem. How do we meet the needs of everybody and keep everybody happy? Compromises like this one don't keep people happy. And then there's the tyranny of the majority. What happens if you're a minority? If what you voted for doesn't happen? Bauman has identified a lack of engagement as an issue for democracy. The voting process replaces the citizen presence in decision-making. So therefore, we become habitually used to other people making decisions for us. And then there's political exclusion and the great contradiction that although we have rights and these rights are afforded to us all equally, many of us do not have the ability to exercise our rights. So who has the power to influence the state? The state creates policy, and this impacts on different groups in different ways. That means the impact's often inequitable. Not all groups have equal power to influence policy and political processes. The more social, cultural and economic capital that you have, remember Bourdieu talking about social capital and economic capital, then the more likely you are to have influence. So if you're a big mining group, you're going to influence the government more so than a small action group who doesn't want mining to happen in the area. That's just one example. Who is politically marginalised and excluded from political processes, therefore poorly represented in Australian society? Let's look at social exclusion. This is a multi-dimensional issue, and it basically means a lack of social participation and a lack of voice. Do you have a small voice? Do you have a voice that people don't listen to? Are you powerless politically? Powerless people, politically powerless people, are often groups and individuals that are discriminated against, stereotyped, stigmatized. Therefore, their rights are being denied to them, and they have what we would call diminished citizenship. Political disengagement is a form of social exclusion, and it's compounded by being economically marginalised and socially marginalised, and it leads to political exclusion. So there is a relationship there. There is a vicious cycle happening there. If you are politically marginalised, your likelihood of voting is decreased. And as a result of political exclusion, democratic participation is falling and political influence is polarising according to class and wealth. So basically what that means is that if you have large amounts of people who are politically excluded, less likely to vote, less likely to be engaged in social inclusion, then those that are included, those that are voting, those that are politically involved, are more likely to be the more powerful group, those of the upper classes and wealthier. So remember our democratic principles. Everyone has the right to be treated equally. Stiglitz, who wrote the very prominent book, The Price of Inequality, argues that much of the inequality that exists today is the result of government policy, both what the government does and what it does not do. So basically, the state implements policies, processes, laws. It's not a benign engagement with the country when the state makes policies and laws. A lot of the inequalities that we see are because of that policy. So the state has this influential role. In that case, then, to what extent is the government enacting democratic principles? And to what extent are they ignoring them? It was once hypothesized that democracy, everybody having the same political rights, would increase social rights. Social rights are the right to participate politically and in the community, to receive welfare, so engagement, social engagement, as well as the right to be looked after by the state. That this basic democracy would increase inclusivity, would it reduce inequality in the community and reduce discrimination. However, after much time, it has been found that the voter actually reacts to the social rights of other people by voting against those people having rights. The voter votes for the increased advancement of themselves and their families. They're not interested in the rights of others within the democracy or within the principles of the democracy. So this is considered to be an issue of democracy. The state creates the rules, and it has the power to ensure compliance. So it creates rules through the parliament and through the legal system. And it ensures compliance, that its authority and its power is complied with, also through the parliament, the courts, the police, the military, the public service. So for instance, the state makes it mandatory that children are educated. If a family doesn't comply with that, then family payments can be reduced or withheld. This also happens with immunisation. The state can withhold family payments if a family doesn't immunise their children. And the same thing happens through the Industrial Relations Commission. If employers don't comply with minimum wage and with paying superannuation, there are penalties to those employers through the Industrial Relations Commission. The state is in a position to carry out their will despite resistance. This makes political parties who are in power extraordinarily powerful when it comes to their interaction with the people. They can not only exert that overt, deliberate force and compliance through the police, courts and armed forces, but also they control the decision-making and political agenda in subtle but effective ways, through either acting when the citizenry wants something to happen or not acting. So ignoring homelessness and the housing crisis, for instance, and doing nothing. They also have the ability to shape and influence the desires of other people through discourse, to convince the citizenry that their desires, their issues are the same as the issues and desires of the powerful. Even though this might not benefit them, they will believe that it will benefit them. So these are the types of power that can be exercised by the state according to Luke's three faces of power. Marx argued that the state was a reflection of class power and that the state was the executive arm of the bourgeoisie. This is about elite power. Is it still relevant today? Let's have a look at what Raywin Connell says. Basically, there's two types of power. You have the elites that own a lot of the corporations, have a lot of the money in society, and then there's the politicians and the state bureaucrats who exercise considerable power in legal and administrative authority. They make the laws, enforce the laws, they make the policy, and they enforce that policy. Mills agrees with this theory. Particularly, what we're interested in today is around politicians and their power, because they have national power and international power, and they can manipulate the rules of society to satisfy their own interests. They influence laws and state and social policy, and therefore have the power to influence inequality and the distribution of resources in society. But the citizenry also has power. Within those social spaces where they can lobby, where protest can happen, where lobby groups and citizen groups, interest groups can come together and influence the state. And a lot of the change that we've seen in society throughout time has happened on this level. So the women's movement, for instance, has been incredibly powerful, and a lot of it has come through lobbying, and a lot of it has come through demonstrations and protests. But there are other ways of doing it as well, through submissions, petitions, and strikes. And we see a lot of online petitions that happen these days, as well as sit-ins and public demonstrations. And because we're a democracy, we should be able to influence the state in these ways. Now, I'd like you to stop listening to the lecture for a little while now and do a learning activity. So you can choose from 4 different learning activities. And once you've done your learning activity, you can go online to the discussion forum and you can talk about what you found. So you can either do this one, which is about the New Zealand Maori representation in Parliament, where New Zealand has dedicated parliamentary seats for Indigenous representatives and has since 1967. So read this. You can just click on that and open it up and have a read of it, and then answer these questions. Explain how dedicated seats are justified in New Zealand. So see if you can articulate that verbally or in writing. And could they work in Australia to increase Indigenous Australians' political representation? And here's another one about Canada and Indigenous representation in Canada. So there has been an unprecedented amount of political candidates voted in the recent Canadian elections. So have a read of this article here. And then answer these questions. What percentage of Indigenous people are there in Canada? And is this percentage represented by representatives in government presently? What issues will they now pursue that they are elected? Does increasing representation also increase the voting population of minorities in Canada? And if so, why? And what does this level of representation mean to the Indigenous people of Canada? See this document to understand more about representation. Oops, I think that's opening it. Okay, sorry, it's opened it on my other screen. I think we're all right here though. So here's another one about Indigenous representation. You can have a look at this document here to see who are the elected Indigenous Australians and where are they situated. And then read this, representative structures, fact sheet. Why? See if you can articulate, in brief, why is representation important? Have a look at these initiatives in New Zealand, Finland, Norway and Sweden. Answer the question, could Australia have something similar? Who should be represented? See if you can articulate that. And as I said, you can go in your discussion forum and talk about it if you want, or you could talk about it with friends and family. And final one is, how representative is Australian politics by gender? So you can have a look at this PDF, a quick guide to the composition of the Australian Parliament, and do a quick gender analysis of the composition by each party. What is the ratio of women to men in each party? What does the ratio mean in terms of valuing gender diversity and inclusion? And have a look at this article. It's incredibly brief. Everything I've given you is pretty brief. So do one of those activities, turn this off, and then come back and watch the end of it. It doesn't go for much longer. So neoliberalism, we're having a very, very quick refresher from last week. So basically neoliberalism came in the 1980s through Margaret Thatcher and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. It's based on the principles that the market is the most effective and most fair way of distributing wealth and prosperity in society, and on many levels it has worked. It has made a lot of countries more prosperous. Based on the principle that the market regulates towards the most efficient allocation of resources. It's strongly lined up with our functionalist theorists' beliefs in merit and rewards, and belief that there is a level playing field for all. It's basically based on all these principles: a free market, no restraints on trade, expanding markets around the globe, the privatisation of industry in all countries, because remember, it used to be that you couldn't just buy things from other countries because your country wanted you to buy it from your country. So there were limits on trade and there were tariffs on trade. But now, with neoliberalism, we've had this expansion of markets and industries are no longer restricted. Also, you have minimalist government, so the government doesn't own the industry anymore, it's privatised. So the government has sold off a lot of what it owned to private purchasers. You need to reduce, in neoliberalism, the expenditure of government, which means you've got to reduce welfare and services. You reduce taxes also, so instead of people being taxed to pay for education, they have less tax and are more likely to spend their own money on their children's education. There's some dismantling of government laws because of that, and a stamping down on unions and protesting. Critique of neoliberalism is that it obscures structural inequalities in the system, in our institutions, by claiming that individuals are responsible for their own successes and their own failures. However, treating everybody equally ensures that a solution cannot be achieved. This is what the critics say, that nothing more assures the perpetuation of inequality than the equal treatment of unequal individuals. So if one group is suffering and one group is fine, you don't give them both the same amount of help, for instance. And that very famous quote derived from something Aristotle said many centuries ago. Now, Bauman argues that we're increasingly impacted on by the global arena. Our fates are tied to international politics, trade relations, and economics. Therefore, the solution to global inequality has got to be the global equivalent of the welfare state, or what he prefers to call the social state. So are global institutions the answer to this problem? So the nation-states were established by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and this was driven by the decline of the Church and the Renaissance period. So basically, before then, we didn't have nation-states. What we had was feudalism and tribalism and lots of warfare. So the nation-state was brought into being to reduce some of that constant warfare. And everything that we know about democracy and the nation-state is fairly new. So what Bauman is suggesting is that we could see an end to the nation-state in the same way that we saw the rising up of it and the end of feudalism and tribalism, and that we go for something bigger now, that we have global and international entities that act as a state. The way the state has been acting and taking care of its citizens, we have bigger institutions on a global and international level that take care of global citizens. Because the welfare state is said to be suffering terribly under neoliberalism. We are considered to be a welfare state, as are Canada, New Zealand, the UK and the USA. This is where the citizen is supposed to be protected and cared for by the state. However, we're also a neoliberal state, and that means that your entitlement to welfare is strictly, I suppose, what would you call it, strictly monitored. And those on welfare are associated with not wanting to work, things like that. The benefits aren't very big, and that's because of a lot of the discourses around welfare. Let's have a look at those. So people say that we need to get rid of the welfare state because we've seen a rise in welfare dependency. More and more people are actually on welfare. However, as we saw in last week's lecture, Australia has reduced taxes and reduced welfare spending. So the discourse that comes along that things are getting worse is statistically wrong, and the economists would show that it was wrong in their figures. But people say that if you give people a lot of money on the unemployment benefits, then they will never get a job. So that's what this one here means. Work evasion is in direct proportion to the size and accessibility of income support payments. So the more payments you give, the less likely people are to work. And this behaviour is associated with a certain type of person. Most people would get a job, but there's these people in society that won't because of the type of person that they are. And that this kind of dependency is a moral affront to society's values in relation to the work ethic. And that's the Protestant work ethic that we're referring to there, which neoliberal principles are associated with. Some arguments are that social policy is by definition a discourse in itself because it is socially constructed and it's informed by our beliefs about welfare in society. This attitude that people will say, well, welfare never was intended to be a career opportunity. If you give them welfare, they'll think it is and they'll never get a job. People will fraud welfare and they will become dependent on welfare. These are discourses. Bauman argues that we would be more democratic if we referred to welfare states as social states, and that this name shifts emphasis away from the distribution of welfare and towards more of a community building motive of their provision. So that is about, well, we provide help and welfare so that we don't have children living on the street, and we don't have children who aren't educated, and we don't have people sick and suffering amongst us in the community. We want a strong, vital, healthy community where people participate and are all considered to be equal and valuable parts of the community. And so by helping people a welfare state, with all the bad associations with the word welfare, we are opening ourselves up to welfare being seen as an issue, whereas if we called it a social state, we'd view it more positively and favourably. Therefore, to conclude, discourses about welfare are interconnected to discourses that underpin neoliberalism. These discourses are linked to inequality occurring in society and linked to policy on welfare. And that's all I have time for this week. Until I talk to you again next week, good luck with your studies.